I've been feeding the same Bigfoot since 1986, and what he finally revealed to me about why his kind fears humans is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Some people might call me crazy for admitting this publicly, but after nearly 4 decades of keeping this secret, I believe it's time the world knows the truth. My name is Thomas McKenna, I'm 66 years old, and I'm a retired forest ranger from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. This is my story, and I need to tell it exactly as it happened, because what I learned changes everything we think we know about these creatures. The autumn of 1986 painted the forests of the Pacific Northwest in shades of amber and crimson. I was 28 years old back then, a newly appointed forest ranger, fresh out of the forestry program at Oregon State University, and eager to prove myself in my first real posting. I'd grown up in Portland, spending my summers camping with my father in the Cascades, developing a deep respect for nature that eventually turned into a career. The crisp October air carried the scent of pine and decomposing leaves as I made my way through the dense woodland that fateful day. It was supposed to be just another routine patrol, checking trail markers, documenting wildlife activity, the usual duties. My supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Bill Henderson, had warned me about the isolation of the job during my orientation. Out here, you're on your own most of the time, Bill had said, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug in the ranger station. Radio only works in certain spots. You see something strange, you document it, but you don't go looking for trouble. These woods have been here longer than any of us, and they've got their secrets. I had nodded, thinking Bill was just being dramatic. After all, what could possibly happen? I was trained for emergencies, knew how to handle wildlife encounters, and had studied every protocol in the Ranger Handbook. I was prepared for bears, cougars, even the occasional lost hiker. What I wasn't prepared for was what happened on October 15, 1986. It was late afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., and the sun was already beginning its descent behind the towering Douglas firs. I was investigating reports of damaged property at an old hunting cabin about 6 miles from the main trail. The cabin belonged to a local family who used it during deer season, and they'd reported finding their storage shed torn apart, food supplies scattered everywhere. As I approached the clearing where the cabin sat, I immediately noticed something was off. The destruction wasn't typical of bears. I'd seen plenty of bear damage during my training. This was different. The shed's door hadn't just been clawed open. It had been wrenched off its hinges with what must have been incredible force. Large, deep impressions in the soft earth around the structure caught my attention. I knelt down to examine them more closely, pulling out my measuring tape and camera. The prints were enormous, at least 17 inches long and 7 inches wide at the widest part. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, with 5 distinct toe impressions, but far too large to be human. The depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy, probably weighing between 600 and 800 pounds based on my estimates. My heart began to race. In all my training, in all the wildlife manuals I'd studied, nothing quite matched what I was seeing. Bears left claw marks. These prints showed no claws, just broad, flat impressions that looked disturbingly like oversized human feet. I spent the next hour documenting everything, taking photographs from multiple angles, making plaster casts of the best prints, measuring the stride length, an astounding 6 feet between steps, and sketching the scene in my field notebook. The professional part of my brain was cataloging data, but another part, a more primal part, was screaming at me to leave. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I had read about this phenomenon, how animals would go silent when a major predator was near. My hand instinctively moved to the bear spray on my hip. That's when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a low, guttural vocalization that seemed to resonate through the trees themselves. Not quite a growl, not quite a howl, but something in between. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards away. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct told me to run, but my training kicked in. I slowly backed toward my truck, parked on the dirt road about 50 yards from the cabin. My eyes scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. My camera hung around my neck, my notepad clutched in one hand, the other hovering near my bear spray. Then I saw it. Between two massive cedar trees, partially obscured by shadow and undergrowth, stood a figure. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it as a person in a dark coat, maybe another hiker. But as my eyes adjusted and the figure shifted slightly, that rationalization crumbled. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb the fading light, broad shoulders that would make an NFL linebacker look small, and it was watching me. I froze. Every wildlife safety protocol I'd ever learned suddenly seemed inadequate. This wasn't in any manual. This wasn't supposed to exist. The creature, and my mind finally accepted that's what it was, didn't move aggressively. It simply stood there, partially hidden, observing. I could make out a face, though not clearly in the shadows, dark eyes that reflected a glimmer of the remaining daylight, a sagittal crest atop its head, similar to what I'd seen in pictures of gorillas, but more pronounced. Time seemed to stop. I later couldn't say if we stood there staring at each other for 30 seconds or 3 minutes. My photographer's instinct screamed at me to raise my camera to document this impossible moment, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. They remained frozen, one clutching my notebook, the other still hovering uselessly near my bear spray. The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost inquisitive. Then, with a movement so swift and fluid it seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard the sound of heavy footfalls and breaking branches, growing fainter as whatever I'd seen moved away. I didn't remember getting into my truck. The next thing I clearly recalled was sitting behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove back to the ranger station in a daze, my mind racing with what I'd witnessed. When I arrived at the station just after sunset, Bill was still there finishing up some paperwork. The older ranger took one look at my pale face and immediately poured me a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to be perpetually brewing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Kid," Bill said, settling into the chair across from me. "What happened out there?" I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Bill would think I was crazy, or worse, that I couldn't handle the isolation of the job. I'd be reassigned, maybe even let go. All my dreams of being a forest ranger would evaporate because I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. Just had a close call with what might have been a bear, I finally said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. Oh, it got spooked. I'm fine now. Bill studied me for a long moment, his gray eyes sharp despite his age. That cabin damage? You document it? Yeah, I said, grateful for the change of subject. I pulled out my camera and notebook, took photos and measurements, made some casts of prints. They're unusual. Might be a large bear, but the prints don't quite match any bear sign I've seen before. Bill flipped through the notebook, his expression unreadable. He looked at the measurements, the sketches, the detailed notes I had made. When he got to the description of the prints, 17 inches long, humanoid shape, no claw marks, he went very still. "These measurements accurate?" Bill asked quietly. "Yes, sir." Triple-checked them. Bill closed the notebook and handed it back to me. "File your report. Document everything you saw. But Thomas," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "out here in these woods, sometimes we see things that don't fit neatly into what we learned in school. Best thing to do is document it professionally and keep an open mind." There was something in Bill's tone that made me look up sharply. The older ranger's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something else, recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Have you ever—" I started to ask, then stopped myself. Bill stood up, stretching his back with an audible crack. "I've been a ranger in these woods for 32 years, kid. I've seen a lot of things. Some of them made it into official reports. Some of them didn't." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Get some rest. And Thomas, if you ever see something unusual, again you can talk to me. Off the record." After Bill left, I sat alone in the station, staring at my notebook. The official report I'd have to file wouldn't mention what I'd really seen. It would be about property damage and unusual tracks, possibly from a large bear. But in my personal journal, locked in my desk drawer, I wrote down every detail of my encounter while it was still fresh in my mind. I described the creature's size, its movements, the way it had watched me with what seemed like intelligence rather than animal curiosity. I sketched what I'd seen, trying to capture the shape of its face, the breadth of its shoulders, the way it had moved through the forest with impossible grace despite its size. That night, lying in my small cabin on the ranger station grounds, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves. But it wasn't fear that kept me awake, not entirely. It was something else. Wonder. Whatever I'd seen out there, it was real. It existed in these forests, living its life in the shadows, avoiding human contact. And somehow, for just a few minutes, I had been allowed to witness it. I didn't know it then, but that October evening would change the entire course of my life. The creature I'd seen, the one that wasn't supposed to exist, the one that lived only in legends and campfire stories, would become the focus of the next 38 years of my life. And in that time, I would learn its secrets. I would discover why it hid from humans with such determination, and that knowledge would break my heart. For 3 weeks after that first encounter, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Every spare moment, I found myself pulling out my field notebook, studying the sketches I'd made, reviewing the measurements of those impossible footprints. The plaster casts sat on my desk like evidence of something the rational part of my brain still wanted to deny. I threw myself into research. During my days off, I drove to the University of Washington Library in Seattle, spending hours in the anthropology and zoology sections. I read every book I could find about Pacific Northwest wildlife, indigenous legends, and yes, even the fringe materials about Bigfoot sightings. What I found was a mixture of obvious hoaxes, genuine mysteries, and Native American traditions that spoke of Sasquatch or Tessimiquez, wild men of the woods who avoided human contact. The Lummi, Snoqualmie, and other Coast Salish peoples had stories going back generations about these creatures. They weren't monsters in their traditions. They were beings to be respected, avoided, left alone. They keep to themselves, one account I read stated. They don't want our world and we shouldn't want theirs. But I did want to know more, not to capture or expose the creature, something deeper than that. I wanted to understand. What was it doing in those woods? Was it alone? How had it remained hidden for so long? And most pressingly, would I ever see it again? The answer came on November 7th, 1986. I had started varying my patrol routes to take me past that hunting cabin more frequently. Not every day. I didn't want to establish an obvious pattern that might draw questions from Bill or the other rangers. But 2 or 3 times a week, I'd find a legitimate reason to be in that area. Checking on winter preparations, documenting pre-snow conditions, monitoring for early season hunters who might be trespassing. It was a gray Friday afternoon, the kind of day where the clouds hung so low they seemed to tangle in the treetops. A light drizzle had been falling since morning, turning the forest floor into a carpet of wet leaves that muffled sound. I was about half a mile from the cabin, documenting some elk tracks, when I heard the sound again, that same low, resonant vocalization that had frozen my blood 3 weeks earlier, but this time I didn't run, my heart hammered in my chest. Adrenaline flooded my system, but I stayed put. Slowly, carefully, I straightened up from where I'd been crouching. My hand went to the bear spray on my belt, but I didn't draw it. Instead, I just stood there, waiting. The sound came again, closer this time, maybe 50 yards away, from a dense thicket of young firs and blackberry bushes. I could hear something large moving through the undergrowth, breaking branches, causing the wet foliage to rustle. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet forest. I felt ridiculous talking to what might be the wind or a bear, but something in my gut told me to try. "I'm just here doing my job. I'm not a threat." The movement stopped. The forest went silent except for the soft patter of rain on leaves. Then, slowly, the branches parted, and there it was again. In the gray daylight, even filtered through rain and mist, I could see it much more clearly than during that first twilight encounter. The creature stood at the edge of the thicket, about 40 yards away, partially concealed but clearly visible, It was every bit as massive as I remembered, probably 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet across. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, longer around the shoulders and head, shorter on the arms and chest. The face was both human and not human. A broad, flat nose, a heavy brow ridge, lips that were more pronounced than a gorilla's, but less than a human's. And the eyes, dark, intelligent eyes that watched me with what I can only describe as cautious curiosity. We stood there in the rain, regarding each other. I noticed details I'd missed in the panic of the first encounter. The creature's hands were enormous, with thick fingers and what looked like fingernails, rather than claws. Its feet, partially visible in the undergrowth, matched the prints I'd cast, broad, flat, surprisingly human-like in structure. It was breathing heavily, its massive chest rising and falling. I could see the rain beating on its hair, rolling off in rivulets. It seemed to be evaluating me, trying to decide something. Very slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, I lowered myself to a sitting position on a fallen log. I wanted to appear non-threatening, to show I wasn't going to chase or attack. I kept my hands visible away from the bear spray. "I saw you before," I said quietly, not sure if speaking was helping or hurting. "At the cabin. I've been hoping I'd see you again." The creature's head tilted slightly, reminding me oddly of a dog trying to understand human speech. Could it comprehend my words, or was it just responding to the tone of my voice? I reached slowly into my jacket pocket and pulled out an apple, part of my lunch that I hadn't eaten. Without standing, without making any aggressive movements, I gently tossed it onto the ground about halfway between us. "I don't know if you eat these," I said, "but if you do, you're welcome to it." For a long moment, nothing happened. The creature stared at the apple, then at me, then back at the apple. I could almost see the thought process happening. Was this a trick? A trap? What did this strange human want? Then, with movements that were surprisingly graceful for something so large, it moved forward. Not all the way to the apple. It stopped about 10 feet from it. Then it did something I never expected. It vocalized again, but differently this time. Not the low resonant sound from before, but a series of shorter sounds, almost like clicks or soft grunts. It was communicating something, though I had no idea what. "I don't understand," I admitted, "but I'm listening." The creature reached down, and I realized for the first time that it had been carrying something. From the undergrowth where it had emerged, it picked up what looked like a branch with several clusters of huckleberries still attached. With a movement that was clearly deliberate, it placed the branch on the ground, then stepped back. My breath caught. It was reciprocating. I had offered food, and it was offering food in return. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking slightly. Thank you." We stayed like that for what must have been 10 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter. The creature eventually reached forward, snatched the apple with surprising speed, and retreated back toward the thicket. It didn't eat the apple immediately. Instead, it held it, examining it, bringing it to its nose to smell it. Then, with one last long look at me, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard it moving away, the sound of its passage fading until there was nothing but rain and wind. I sat there on that log for another 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally stood up, my legs were shaky. I walked to where the creature had left the huckleberry branch and carefully picked it up. The berries were fresh, perfectly ripe. I ate one. It was sweet and delicious. That night, I added another entry to my private journal, documenting every detail of the encounter. But I also started a new section, a log of interactions, because I knew somehow that this wouldn't be the last time. I was right. Over the next 3 months, I encountered the creature 6 more times. Never at the same place, never at the same time of day, but always in roughly the same area of the forest, a territory of maybe 4 or 5 square miles around that hunting cabin. The pattern that emerged was fascinating. The creature seemed to be monitoring my movements, keeping track of when and where I patrolled. Sometimes I'd hear it before I'd see it, that distinctive vocalization that I was beginning to recognize. Other times I'd simply feel watched and would catch a glimpse of it, observing from a distance. I started bringing offerings every time I patrolled that area. Apples, granola bars, sometimes sandwich leftovers from my lunch. I'd leave them on stumps or rocks, in places where I'd seen signs of the creature's presence. They were always gone by my next patrol, and the creature left things in return. Not every time, but often enough that I recognized it as intentional. Interesting stones, pine cones arranged in small piles, once a perfect bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. It was trying to communicate, to establish some kind of rapport. By late January 1987, something remarkable happened. I was on patrol, had just left one of my usual offerings, a couple of protein bars and an orange, when I heard movement behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was, less than 20 feet away, but this time it didn't keep its distance. It moved closer, stopping about 10 feet from me, close enough that I could see the texture of its hair, the way its chest moved with each breath, the incredible detail of its face. We looked at each other, and I saw something in its eyes that changed everything. Not just intelligence, I'd already recognized that, but something deeper, sadness maybe. Wariness born of experience. This wasn't just an animal trying to figure out if I was a threat. This was a thinking being, one that had learned to fear my kind, trying to decide if I was different. "I won't hurt you," I said softly, "and I won't tell anyone about you. You have my word." I don't know if it understood my words, but it seemed to understand my intent. It reached down, picked up the protein bars, carefully, almost delicately despite its massive hands, and made a sound. Not the warning vocalization, not the curious clicks. Something else. Something that sounded almost like appreciation. Then it did something that brought tears to my eyes. It reached out one enormous hand and gently touched a nearby tree trunk, then looked at me and touched its own chest. It was showing me something. The forest was its home, its chest itself. It was telling me who it was in relation to this place. I mirrored the gesture, touching the tree, then my own chest. "This is your home," I said. "I understand." "I'll respect that." The creature watched me for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. But before it disappeared into the trees, it looked back once, and I could have sworn, I know this sounds impossible, but I could have sworn it was making sure I was still there, still watching. That was the moment everything changed. That was when a simple forest ranger's curiosity became something more. A commitment, a promise, a friendship, if such a thing could exist between species so different, yet somehow not different at all. I had no idea then that this relationship would span decades. I had no idea that I would eventually learn this creature's story, understand its fears, discover the dark truth about what humans had done to drive its kind into hiding. All I knew in that moment was that I had been entrusted with something precious, a secret, a connection to something the world thought didn't exist, and I was determined to protect it, no matter what it cost me. The years that followed taught me patience I never knew I possessed. Building trust with a creature that had every reason to fear humans wasn't a matter of weeks or months. It was years of consistent, careful interaction. By the spring of 1987, I had established a routine. 3 times a week, I'd make my way to what I'd begun thinking of as our territory, that 5-square-mile area of forest where the creature seemed to live. I'd bring food, always varied, fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, sometimes dried meats or fish. I learned through trial and error what it preferred. Apples were always a hit, berries of any kind. It seemed to especially enjoy salmon, not surprising given we were in the Pacific Northwest. I'd leave the offerings in specific locations, and over time, the creature began meeting me at these spots. Not every time, but increasingly often. Sometimes it would watch from a distance. Other times it would approach, take the food, and leave something in return. Always these small gifts, interesting rocks, shells from the river, once a perfect set of deer antlers it must have found. But the real breakthrough came in June of that year. I had arrived at one of our usual meeting spots, a small clearing near a creek that ran through the forest. I'd brought a bag full of apples, some carrots, and a large salmon I'd caught that morning in the Columbia River. I was arranging the food on a flat rock when I heard the now familiar sound of heavy footfalls. Approaching, the creature emerged from the tree line, but this time it wasn't alone. My heart nearly stopped. Behind the large male I'd been meeting with, I'd determined it was male based on its size and build, was a smaller figure, still large by human standards, maybe 7 feet tall with slightly reddish-brown fur instead of dark brown. It hung back, partially hidden behind the larger creature, watching me with obvious nervousness. "You brought someone?" I said softly, keeping my voice calm despite my racing pulse. "That's okay. There's plenty of food." The larger creature, I'd started thinking of him as Old Jack, though I never said the name aloud, made a series of soft vocalizations toward the smaller one. It sounded almost like encouragement or reassurance. The communication between them was clear, even if I couldn't understand the specifics. Slowly, Old Jack approached the rock where I'd laid out the food. He picked up the salmon, his favorite, but instead of eating it or taking it away, he turned and offered it to the smaller creature. A female, I realized, watching the interaction. His mate, perhaps, or a sibling. She approached cautiously, eyes never leaving me. When she was about 15 feet away, Old Jack made another soft sound, and she quickly took the salmon from his hands and retreated back toward the tree line. But she didn't leave entirely. She stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching as Old Jack gathered up some of the apples and carrots. Before he left, Old Jack did something he'd never done before. He sat down right there in the clearing, about 20 feet from where I stood. He began eating one of the apples, watching me as he did so. I understood what he was doing. He was showing the female that I was safe, that this human could be trusted. It was the most profound gesture of trust he'd shown me yet. I sat down too on a log on my side of the clearing, and we ate together in companionable silence. Well, I ate an energy bar from my pack while he worked through 3 apples. The female eventually ventured close enough to grab a few carrots before retreating again. That day marked a turning point. Over the following months, I met the female several more times. She was more skittish than Old Jack, always keeping her distance, but she was getting used to my presence. And I began to understand something profound. These creatures had a social structure, relationships, possibly even families. As 1987 turned into 1988, and then 1989, my relationship with Old Jack deepened in ways I never could have anticipated. He began showing me things, not just accepting food, but actually trying to communicate more complex ideas. One day in the fall of 1989, he led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone in that area. I followed at a respectful distance, curious but cautious. We walked for maybe 20 minutes before we came to a small cave, barely visible behind a curtain of hanging moss and ferns. Old Jack stopped at the entrance and gestured toward it, an unmistakable look at this motion. I approached slowly and peered inside. The cave was small, maybe 10 feet deep, but dry and sheltered. And inside were things that made my breath catch. Carefully arranged piles of food, nuts, dried berries, roots, a bed of soft ferns and moss, and, most startling of all, tools. Crude, but unmistakable. Rocks that had been shaped for specific purposes. Sticks weren't smooth from use. "This is your home," I said. Looking back at Old Jack, "You're showing me where you live." He made a soft sound, one I'd come to recognize as affirmation. But there was something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like vulnerability. He was trusting me with his most vital secret, where he was most vulnerable, where he slept, where he kept his supplies. I backed away from the cave entrance immediately. "Thank you for showing me," I said. "I won't tell anyone, and I'll never come here without you. You have my word." Over the next several years, our bond continued to grow. I learned to read his vocalizations, to understand the subtle differences in tone and pitch that conveyed different meanings. He learned to recognize my vehicle's engine sound would often be waiting when I arrived. We developed our own form of communication, part vocalization, part gesture, part intuition. By 1995, I had been meeting with Old Jack for 9 years. In that time, I'd seen the female. I'd started thinking of her as Sarah, though, again, just in my mind, dozens of times. I'd witnessed what I believed were courtship behaviors between them. I'd seen Old Jack bring her gifts of food, seen them sit together at the edge of clearings while I left offerings. And then, in the spring of 1995, something incredible happened. I arrived at one of our meeting spots to find old Jack waiting, but he was agitated. He was pacing back and forth, making sounds I'd never heard before, urgent, almost distressed. My first thought was that he was injured, or that Sarah was hurt. "What's wrong?" I asked, immediately concerned. "Are you okay? Is Sarah okay?" He moved toward me, then away, then back again. He was trying to get me to follow him. Without hesitation, I did. He led me on a path through the forest, moving faster than usual, but checking back frequently to make sure I was keeping up. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before he brought me to a small grove of cedar trees. And there, hidden in a nest of ferns and moss, was Sarah, and in her arms, barely visible against her reddish fur, was the smallest Bigfoot I'd ever seen. A baby. They had a baby. I stopped dead in my tracks, overwhelmed by emotion. Sarah looked at me with eyes that held both protectiveness and something else. Perhaps the hope that I would react appropriately to this moment. "Oh my God," I whispered. "You have a baby." The infant couldn't have been more than a few days old. Its eyes were barely open, and it clung to Sarah with tiny hands that were perfect miniatures of its parents. Its fur was lighter than both parents, almost golden brown. Old Jack moved to stand between me and his family, not aggressively, but protectively. He made a soft sound, and I understood what he was communicating. "Look, but don't approach." "I understand," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Congratulations, both of you. This is wonderful." I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just watching from a respectful distance, as Sarah cradled her baby, as old Jack stood guard. Then, understanding that I'd been shown something sacred, something private, I slowly backed away. Before I left, old Jack followed me a short distance. When we were out of earshot of Sarah and the baby, he did something remarkable. He placed one of his massive hands on a tree trunk, then on his chest, the gesture we'd established years ago for home or self. Then he pointed back toward where his family was, and made the softest, most gentle sound I'd ever heard from him. He was telling me about his family, about what they meant to him, about love in a language that transcended species. "I'll protect them," I promised him. "I'll protect all of you, always." And I meant it with every fiber of my being. Over the next months and years, I watched that baby grow. I saw it take its first wobbly steps, watched it learn to forage for food, saw old Jack teach it which plants were safe to eat, how to catch fish from the streams. It was like being granted a window into a world that shouldn't exist, a secret that the forest had kept for thousands of years. The young one, I thought of it as Little Jack, though I later learned it was actually female, was curious about me in a way her parents never quite were. By the time she was 2 years old, she would approach much closer than Sarah ever had, though always under the watchful eyes of her parents. But as the years passed, I began to notice something troubling. Old Jack was showing signs of trauma I hadn't recognized before. Sometimes when I'd arrive for our meetings, I'd find him agitated, pacing, making distressed sounds. He'd lead me to areas of the forest where there were signs of human activity, old campsites, trash that had been left behind, once even a hunting stand that had been built in a tree. He was showing me intrusions into his territory. And more than that, he seemed to be trying to tell me something about humans, about why he and his kind stayed hidden, about what had made them so fearful. It would take many more years before I understood the full truth. Before old Jack finally revealed to me the dark reason why Bigfoot avoids humans with such determination. But by the late 1990s, I knew I was on the edge of discovering something profound and heartbreaking. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about the relationship between humans and these magnificent creatures. The turn of the millennium brought changes to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. More hikers, more tourists, more people seeking escape in the wilderness that had once been relatively isolated. For me, now in my early 40s and a senior ranger, it meant more patrols, more regulations to enforce, and more opportunities for human Bigfoot encounters that could go terribly wrong. I became hypervigilant about Old Jack's territory, always finding reasons to patrol that area more frequently. If I saw signs of illegal camping or hunting near where I knew he and his family spent time, I'd shut it down immediately, sometimes making up violations to move people along. My colleagues probably thought I was overzealous, but I didn't care. I had a secret to protect. By 2003, little Jack, who I'd learned was actually female when she reached maturity, was 8 years old and almost as tall as Sarah. She'd grown comfortable enough with me that she'd sometimes approach within arm's reach. Though I never tried to touch her, that boundary felt sacred, something that shouldn't be crossed even after 17 years of trust building. It was during that summer that everything changed, that I finally learned the truth I'd been sensing but couldn't quite grasp. I arrived at our usual meeting spot on a warm July afternoon, carrying a cooler full of fresh salmon and berries. Old Jack was there, but something was wrong. He was sitting on the ground, hunched over, making low, pained sounds that I'd never heard before. "Jack?" I called out, dropping the cooler and moving toward him without thinking. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" He looked up at me, and what I saw in his eyes stopped me in my tracks. Not physical pain, something deeper. Emotional anguish. Memories surfacing that he'd kept buried. He stood slowly, and for the first time in all our years together, he approached me directly. He came within 5 feet, closer than he'd ever been, and then did something that made my breath catch. He turned his back to me and lifted his left arm. His fur, which usually lay smooth and thick, was disrupted along his left side. And underneath, visible through the thinner hair, were scars. Deep old scars that ran in parallel lines across his ribs and down his back. They were partially hidden by fur that had grown back over them, but once I knew to look, they were unmistakable. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Jack, what happened to you?" He turned back to face me and began to communicate in a way he never had before. Using gestures, vocalizations, and a form of pantomime, he started to tell me his story. He pointed to himself, then held his hand low to the ground, indicating he'd been young. Then he held up both hands, fingers spread, representing many. A group, a family. My heart began to sink as I understood. He'd had a family before Sarah, before I met him. He made walking motions with his fingers, showing movement through the forest. Then he stopped and crouched low, making himself small, hiding. He pointed to his eyes, then gestured outward, watching. Then he formed his hands into the shape of a gun. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Hunters," I said. "Hunters found your family." He made an affirmative sound, but there was such pain in it that tears sprang to my eyes. He continued his story, showing me through gesture what words couldn't convey. His family had been attacked. He'd been young, maybe equivalent to a teenager. He'd watched from hiding as hunters. He showed me multiple figures, maybe 4 or 5, had cornered his family. He showed me running, showed me the sound of gunfire by clapping his hands sharply, showed me falling, being wounded. His hand traced along those scars on his side. "You were shot," I said, my voice breaking. "They shot you," he nodded, a gesture he'd learned from watching me over the years. Then he showed me playing dead, lying still while the hunters approached. He made gestures of the hunters examining something, talking, arguing maybe, then leaving. He'd survived by pretending to be dead. But his family, Old Jack's massive shoulders shook. He made a sound of such profound grief that I couldn't help myself. I took a step closer and placed my hand on a nearby tree, the gesture we used for "I'm here." "I understand." He looked at me with eyes full of ancient pain and continued. He showed me staying hidden, watching from the shadows as more humans came. Different ones this time. He gestured at clothing that looked official, maybe uniforms. They'd taken the bodies away, covered everything up, made it disappear. "That's why you hide," I said, understanding finally washing over me. "That's why all of you hide. Because we hunt you. Because we've always hunted you." He made another affirmative sound, but then he did something else. He formed his hands into shapes I'd seen before. Small shapes, medium shapes, large shapes. He was showing me different groups, different families. Then he showed them disappearing one by one, getting smaller and fewer. "There aren't many of you left, are there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He held up both hands, fingers spread, then closed them into fists, opened them again, showing fewer fingers, then fewer, over and over, showing me populations declining. His kind was disappearing, being hunted, being driven from their territories as humans expanded into every corner of the wilderness. How long ago? I asked. How long ago did you lose your family? He showed me seasons passing, the gesture he used for years. Once, twice, 3 times. He kept going. 7 times, 8, 9 times he showed me the cycle of seasons, 9 years before I met him. He'd been living alone, traumatized and hiding for nearly a decade before that day in 1986, when he'd watched me investigate the hunting cabin. He'd been observing humans, trying to understand if any of us could be trusted, if any of us were different from the ones who destroyed his family, and somehow, he'd decided to take a chance on me. I'm so sorry, I said, tears streaming down my face now. I'm so sorry for what they did to you, for what my species has done to yours. Old Jack made a soft sound and did something he'd never done before. He reached out one massive hand and gently touched my shoulder, just for a moment, then pulled back. But in that gesture was forgiveness, understanding, acknowledgement that I was different, that not all humans were the same. He pointed to himself, then to Sarah, and showed me little Jack's size when she was born. He'd found Sarah years after the attack, both of them alone, both survivors. They'd formed a new family, found a way to keep living despite the trauma and fear, but the scars remained, the memories remained, the terror that drove them deeper into the shrinking wilderness remained. Over the next several visits, old Jack revealed more. He showed me other signs he'd found in the forest over the years, spent bullet casings, broken equipment, places where others of his kind had been hunted. He led me to a hidden valley deeper in the mountains where he said others sometimes gathered. A sanctuary of sorts. Though he showed me it was getting harder to reach as roads and development crept closer, he showed me photographs. Yes, photographs. Hidden away in a waterproof container in his cave were old newspaper clippings and photos that he'd collected over the years. Evidence of his kind being hunted, being displayed as trophies, being treated as monsters instead of the intelligent, peaceful beings they were. The clippings were from the 1960s and 70s, yellow with age. Headlines about Bigfoot hunting expeditions and Sasquatch bounties. Photos of men with guns, grinning as they posed in the forest. Some of the articles described creatures that had been killed, though the bodies were always mysteriously lost or confiscated by authorities. They've been hunting you for sport, I said, looking at the evidence he'd carefully preserved. For trophies, for proof, for money, he nodded, then showed me something else. Gestures indicating capture, cages, laboratories. Some of his kind hadn't just been hunted and killed, they'd been captured, taken alive. He didn't know where or by whom, but he knew it had happened. The fear of it was passed down through the remaining families, a terror that kept them nocturnal, kept them silent, kept them hidden. I understood then why Bill Henderson had reacted the way he did all those years ago when he'd seen my first report, why he'd told me some things didn't make it into official records. He'd known. Maybe he'd even seen evidence himself. The government, or parts of it, knew these creatures existed. And for reasons I could only guess at, to prevent panic, to protect corporate interests, to maintain control over the narrative, they kept it secret. And in that secrecy, Bigfoot had no protection, no rights, no acknowledgement of their existence that might make killing them murder instead of just an unusual form of hunting. I'll protect you, I promised old Jack again, but this time with full understanding of what I was protecting them from. I'll keep your secret. I'll watch over your territory. And I'll teach little Jack to be careful, to be hidden, to survive. He touched my shoulder again, that same gentle gesture. Then he gathered up the newspaper clippings and photos, carefully placing them back in their waterproof container. Evidence of a genocide that no one acknowledged. Proof of a species being systematically eliminated while the world pretended they didn't exist. As I left the forest that day, I felt the weight of what I'd learned crushing down on me. For 17 years, I'd been feeding a friend, building a relationship I treasured. But I'd been naive about what that friendship meant. In the larger context, old Jack hadn't just been accepting my food and company. He'd been teaching me, preparing me to understand, making sure that at least one human knew the truth so that maybe, somehow, that truth wouldn't die with him and his kind. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How many were left? How long before they were gone entirely? What could one forest ranger possibly do against the forces that had been hunting them for generations? But I knew one thing for certain. I would do whatever I could. For old Jack, for Sarah, for little Jack, and for whatever others remained hidden in the deep forests. They deserved to exist. They deserved to be left in peace. And I would spend the rest of my career making sure that in at least this one corner of the wilderness, they would be safe. The years moved on, quiet but heavy. I never spoke of old Jack's story, not to my wife, not to my closest co-workers, not even to Bill in his final years on duty. It wasn't just secrecy for secrecy's sake. I understood now that speaking their truth carelessly could mean extinction. One wrong word, and someone with the wrong intentions could trace my patrol logs, investigate the region, and destroy everything they had left. By the time 2010 arrived, I had spent 24 years guarding that family. 24 years of meeting the same towering figure beneath the cedars, of exchanging offerings, of watching little Jack grow from a curious child into a poised young adult. Her fur darkened to a deep russet, and she moved with a confidence that could only come from parents who taught her every hidden trail, every freshwater pool, every scent carried by the wind. I watched her learn to fish in the Lewis River just as I'd seen children learn to ride bikes. She slipped silently between mossy rocks, catching salmon with motions so fluid they felt rehearsed, like art passed down through generations. Old Jack watched from the riverbank, chest forward, proud. Sometimes he'd glance toward me, as if making sure I was seeing what he saw, proof that his lineage continued, despite everything that had tried to erase them. By then, I wasn't just feeding a creature, I was witnessing a legacy. As the world around us changed, new highways, cameras in every hand, more people flooding the wilderness in search of experiences, I began to fear that time was running out. More than once, I convinced hikers to try a different trail, inventing closures or safety hazards to keep them away. A few times, I intercepted hunters setting up blinds too close to old Jack's territory. I confiscated equipment, wrote tickets, even threatened to report them for poaching when no laws technically covered what they were doing. But every year, I saw more evidence of intrusion, and every year old Jack grew more tense. Sometimes he'd bring me branches snapped cleanly in half, his signal that strangers had been near. Other times he would show me impressions in the mud, boot prints, and look at me with that same haunted fear that first surfaced when he showed me his scars. One late autumn night, I heard him before I saw him. I'd been hiking in dense fog, headlights from my truck cutting into the quiet. His call came from somewhere beyond the creek, low and trembling. I had never heard him sound afraid for himself, only for others. I hurried toward the sound. The forest was unusually silent. No owls, no insects, just mist and the quiet hum of distant river water. Old Jack emerged from behind a cluster of Douglas firs, shoulders tense, posture braced. He motioned for me to follow, urgently. I'd seen this once before, the day he showed me little Jack for the first time. My chest tightened. Something was wrong. We hiked for nearly 20 minutes, deeper than I'd ever gone without his guidance. Even in the fog, he moved confidently, checking behind him often to be sure I kept up. Finally, we reached a clearing I didn't recognize. There, seated on the ground, was Sarah. Her usually bright eyes looked dull, unfocused. She leaned against a fallen log, breathing shallowly, fur clinging to her side where blood, dark and already drying, matted through. My stomach dropped. She had been shot. Old Jack lowered himself beside her, making soft, rhythmic sounds, reassurance, comfort. Little Jack knelt on the other side, her huge hands trembling as she tried to clean the wound with soaked moss. I took careful steps forward. "I'm here," I whispered, though I knew my words meant little. Still, old Jack looked at me with something desperate in his eyes, pleading. He trusted me. I knelt, examining the wound without touching. The bullet had grazed through muscle, high enough to miss organs, low enough to slow her to a crawl. A hunting round still lodged deep. Sarah exhaled a soft noise that sounded almost like apology. Little Jack's hand brushed her cheek, and in the dim, fog-filtered moonlight, I understood I wasn't just witnessing injury. I was witnessing fear. Fear anchored in history, fear of a cycle repeating. Whoever had done this was close, and they would return. I didn't have medical tools, not out here. And even if I had, I'd never done more than assist veterinarians in the park with tranquilized bears and elk. But I knew infection. I knew wounds. I knew, painfully, that standard help was not an option. "I need to clean it," I murmured. Old Jack lowered his head in acknowledgement. I fetched my canteen, soaked a cloth, and began carefully cleaning the matted fur just to see the extent of bleeding. Sarah trembled with each pass. I spoke softly, keeping my tone steady. Little Jack watched every movement, absorbing, learning. The round was still deep. I didn't dare extract it, not with my hands, not here. Removing it could kill her faster. "We have to keep it clean," I said, unsure whether I was reassuring them or myself. "I'll bring supplies, medicine, antiseptic." Old Jack made a low, steady sound. Agreement. When I finished, Sarah let out a faint exhale, relief or exhaustion. Little Jack helped adjust a bedding of thick ferns beneath her. I placed my hand on the trunk of the cedar beside them, our gesture of promise. "I'll be back before sunrise." I hesitated only one moment before running through the fog, branches slapping against my arms, lungs burning. I reached my truck, drove like a man possessed back to my cabin. If anyone saw me, I had practiced explanations, routine medical emergency, wildlife rescue, anything. But the roads were empty. Inside my cabin, I grabbed everything I had: medical gauze, antibiotic, ointment, iodine, pain relievers. I ground into powder a hunting knife, a clean blanket. I turned to leave and froze. My cabin window facing the tree line was open. I never left it open. A sheet of notebook paper lay on the counter. At first, I thought it was something I'd left out, maybe a note to myself. But the handwriting wasn't mine. It was bold, heavy strokes like someone unused to writing. "Don't go back there." My blood ran cold. I checked the locks, intact. Nothing stolen. No vehicles outside. But someone had been here. Someone who knew. I grabbed my supplies anyway and returned to the forest. The fog was still thick when I returned, though the eastern horizon had begun to crack open with the first silver hints of dawn. I made my way back to the grove as quietly as I could, praying no one had followed. Old Jack met me halfway, towering and restless, every muscle coiled tight. He ushered me quickly to Sarah. She didn't look good, breathing shallow, eyes barely open. Little Jack held her mother's hand, rocking slightly, a movement I'd seen human children make when frightened. I started working immediately. Clean water, iodine, gauze. The wound responded, bleeding slowed, breathing steadied. Not healed, not safe, but stabilized. All the while, old Jack watched the tree line. Not me. Not Sarah, the forest. He knew danger better than anyone. When I finished, he let out a sound, soft, grateful. Little Jack pressed her forehead gently to Sarah's. The family huddled close, breathing as one. I was about to leave them to rest when a new sound shattered the quiet. A branch crack, sharp and deliberate. 3 silhouettes emerged through the fog. Human, they moved with confidence. They carried rifles. Old Jack rose to his full height. A silent wall between danger and family. My heart slammed against my ribs. The hunters had returned. They emerged from the fog like phantoms, 3 men in camouflage, rifles slung tight to their chests, boots sinking softly into the moss-covered soil. Their faces were hard, eyes sharp, scanning the grove as though they'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. The tallest lifted a pair of binoculars, and even through the haze I knew when he saw Old Jack. His breath hitched. He whispered, "There." Old Jack didn't roar, didn't threaten, didn't move toward them. He simply stood, broad, towering, unyielding, placing his body between the hunters and his family. I raised my hands immediately. "Stop! Don't do this." My voice cracked through the clearing. The men turned their attention to me. Recognition flickered. One of them narrowed his eyes. "McKenna?" I froze. "They knew my name?" "You've been interfering out here for years," another said. "Driving people off, red flagging reports." Should have known you were hiding something. You don't understand, I said, palms out. They're not hostile. They just want to be left alone. They're animals, the leader replied coldly. You know how much one of these things is worth? Old Jack made a soft, low sound, not aggression, a plea. Little Jack crouched behind him, gripping Sarah's hand. You shoot him, I said, and you'll prove everything he's ever believed about us. The leader exhaled, steadying his rifle. We're taking one. Doesn't matter which. I stepped in front of him. You'll have to shoot me first. For a moment, the forest held its breath. Moss, damp air, distant river. 3 rifles, a family terrified, silent. A line in the dirt, the leader's jaw clenched. He didn't raise his weapon again, but he didn't lower it either. You think you can stop this? He hissed. You've spent your whole career babysitting monsters. But you're one man. Retire, and all this goes away. I kept my voice quiet, steady. I've watched them raise their child. I've seen them mourn their dead. They feel the world the same way we do. If you wanted proof they were dangerous, you would have had it the moment you stepped into this clearing. Silence. Their rifles pointed just a little less tightly. Behind me, Old Jack made a sound, low, resonant. I'd heard it only once before, the day he told me of his scars. He took a single step forward, not threatening, standing tall, claiming his right to exist. The hunters hesitated because for a moment they saw him as I did, not a monster, not a myth, a father, a survivor. The leader finally exhaled, gaze shifting from Jack to the wounded Sarah, then to little Jack trembling, trying to be brave. He cursed under his breath. Forget it, he muttered. They moved deeper. We'll never track them, one of the others protested. We can mark the spot. No. The leader cut him off. We go, and just like that, they turned. They melted back into the fog. No victory celebration. No parting blow, just a reluctant retreat. When the forest swallowed them, the tension snapped like a cut wire. My legs nearly gave out. Old Jack's head bowed, not in fear but in gratitude. Sarah breathed easier. Little Jack let out a trembling sigh, touching her father's arm the way children do when they don't have language for relief. I knelt, shaking. They'll come back, I whispered. Maybe not today, but someday. You have to go deeper, farther. Old Jack looked toward the mountains, snow-capped silhouettes beyond the ridgeline, places where humans rarely tread, places even rangers seldom patrol. He understood. He turned to Sarah, then to little Jack. They rose together, leaning into one another, a single silhouette of family. Before they left, Old Jack placed his hand on the cedar trunk, our old gesture, and then on his own chest. Home, self, memory. I mirrored him, tears blurring my vision. Then he stepped forward and, just once, rested his massive hand over my heart. A thank you, a goodbye, a passing of duty. They disappeared into the mist, 3 shades returning to the ancient world that birthed them. I never saw them again. I retired in 2016. Sometimes, when hikers file reports of strange sounds in the distance, or footprints too large to belong to any bear, I smile because somewhere, beyond the places where roads go and maps end, a family still walks beneath the cedars. A living piece of history, quiet, cautious, enduring, and though the world never knew their names, I remember them. Old Jack, Sarah, Little Jack. I still leave apples on a stump deep in Gifford Pinchot, where moss grows thick and the canopy swallows the sky. They're always gone by morning. Maybe it's deer, maybe it's raccoons, or maybe it's a promise being kept, because some secrets aren't meant to be solved, just honored.